My house in Savannah, Georgia, is not a house of straight lines. It's a beautifully, stubbornly crooked old lady of a place built in the 1890s. A time when architects apparently believed that a floor should have the gentle, rolling character of the sea. The floorboards, made of heart pine and worn smooth by over a century of life, creak and groan a familiar, comforting language. They speak of my late husband, Robert, and the 50 years of happy, chaotic, and wonderful life we lived within these walls. They speak of dinner parties, of Christmases, of quiet Sunday mornings with the windows open, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant, mournful sound of a ship's horn from the river. For the 2 years after Robert passed, the silence in this house was the loudest sound in the world. The creaks of the floorboards were no longer a conversation, they were an echo. It was my daughter, a practical woman with a sensible job in Atlanta, who suggested I get a roommate. You can't keep rattling around in that big old place by yourself, Mom, she'd said. The upkeep is a fortune, and besides, it's not good to be so alone. She was right, of course. The loneliness was a physical presence, a permanent, uninvited guest at my dinner table, and so, with a great deal of trepidation, I placed an ad. Not on Craigslist, I wasn't that brave, but in the newsletter of our local historical society. Widow, 72, seeks quiet, responsible retiree to share large, historic home, non-smoker, must enjoy old movies and the company of a slightly neurotic basset hound. That is how I met Arthur. Arthur Finch was, in every way, the perfect answer to my quiet prayer. He was a 74-year-old retired history professor, a recent widower himself, who had just moved to Savannah to be closer to his own daughter. He was charming, erudite, and had a gentle, sad kindness in his eyes that I recognized immediately. We spent his interview on my front porch, drinking sweet tea and discovering our shared love for Turner Classic Movies and a mutual disdain for modern, minimalist architecture. He even got along with my basset hound, Winston, who was a notoriously poor judge of character, but had, I thought, finally gotten it right. He moved into the upstairs guest suite the following month, and for a full year our arrangement was a quiet, comfortable blessing. It was not a romance, it was a companionship, a gentle, platonic partnership of two people in the twilight of their lives, navigating the vast, lonely ocean of grief. We would have dinner together a few nights a week. I'd cook, he'd do the dishes, we'd watch old black and white movies. In the evenings, quoting our favorite lines from Casablanca and the Philadelphia Story, he was a quiet, respectful presence in my home. The house was no longer silent. The creaks of the floorboards were a conversation again. The loneliness had receded. I was, for the first time since Robert's passing, content. And then Arthur met Brenda. He met her at a ballroom dancing class for seniors, a new hobby he had taken up with a hopeful, almost boyish enthusiasm. He came home from the class one evening, his face flushed with a joy I had not seen on him before. I met someone, Helen, he'd said, his voice full of a shy, giddy excitement. Her name is Brenda. She's a wonderful dancer. I was, at first, genuinely happy for him. The sadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a new, vibrant light. He deserved to find happiness again. We all did. He brought Brenda over for dinner the following week. She was a lot. Where Arthur was quiet and reserved, Brenda was a whirlwind of loud, boisterous, and slightly overwhelming energy. She was a woman in her late 60s, with a cloud of suspiciously blonde hair, a laugh that could shatter glass, and a wardrobe that seemed to consist entirely of brightly coloured animal print. Fabrics. She was, however, undeniably charming. She complimented my house, my cooking, my dog. She listened to my stories about Robert with a rapt, empathetic attention. She made Arthur laugh, a real, deep, belly laugh that I hadn't heard in the entire year he had lived in my house. She's good for him, I thought to myself, a small, hopeful smile on my face. She's bringing him back to life. The next week, she was over for dinner 3 times. The week after that, she was there every night. She and Arthur were inseparable, a whirlwind of late-life romance. My quiet, peaceful house was suddenly filled with her loud laughter, the sound of the pop music she insisted on playing, a stark contrast to my usual classical station. It was a disruption, but I told myself it was a happy one. It was the sound of my friend finding joy, and then the colonization began. It was a slow, insidious, and almost imperceptible invasion. It started, as I imagine most invasions do, with a toothbrush. I went into the upstairs guest bathroom one morning to find a bright pink toothbrush sitting in the holder next to Arthur's sensible blue one, a small, intimate, and deeply significant flag planted in a newly claimed territory. A few days later, I was doing laundry and found a lacy, leopard print brassiere tangled in with Arthur's bedsheets. I held the offending object with the tips of my fingers, a feeling of deep, prudish discomfort washing over me. This was my home, my private space, and it was slowly, but surely, being filled with the intimate detritus of my roommate's very active love life. Soon, it was more than just a toothbrush and a bra. I opened Arthur's closet one day to put away his dry cleaning, and I found that a quarter of the space had been taken over by her clothes, sequin tops, floral dresses, a whole rack of her brightly coloured, synthetic-looking outfits. She had not just stayed the night. She had moved in, but it was the small, daily invasions of my own space that began to truly grate on my nerves. She was a woman with no concept of boundaries. She would come into the kitchen while I was cooking and begin to reorganize my spice rack, telling me that her system was so much more intuitive. She would help herself to the expensive olive oil I special ordered, the good cheese I bought from the farmer's market. She treated my carefully curated pantry as a free, communal grocery store. Her slow, creeping takeover of the living room was the most difficult part. Our quiet evenings of watching old movies were over. Now, the television was permanently tuned to her favorite reality shows, loud, garish programs about housewives who yelled at each other on yachts. Oh, not another one of your sad, black and white Movies, Arthur, she'd say with a loud, theatrical sigh, snatching the remote from his hand. Let's watch something fun, something with a little life. Arthur, my quiet, gentle friend, would just give me a small, apologetic shrug and let her. He was so completely besotted, so terrified of disrupting his newfound happiness, that he had become a willing accomplice to her slow, steady erasure of the comfortable world we had built. I tried to be polite. I tried to be accommodating. I am, by nature, a non-confrontational person. I would leave gentle, polite notes. Brenda, could you please remember to run the dishwasher when it's full? Thank you. I would make quiet, gentle requests. Brenda, that is my mother's antique porcelain vase. I would be so grateful if you would not use it as an ashtray for your incense sticks. Her response was always the same, a bright, dazzling, and utterly insincere smile. Oh my goodness, silly me. Of course, Helen, I'm so sorry. I'm still just learning the rules of your beautiful home. But she would do it again the next day. The apologies were not apologies. They were a form of psychological warfare, a way of making me feel like the crazy, uptight, and unreasonable one for simply asking for a basic level of respect in my own damn house. The house was no longer my own. The quiet, peaceful sanctuary I had shared with my husband, the comfortable, companionable space I had shared with my roommate, was now a hostile, occupied territory. Brenda's loud, brassy, and relentlessly invasive presence was a constant, low-grade hum of stress in my life. And Arthur, my friend, was so lost in his late-life love affair that he was completely, utterly, and infuriatingly useless. The quiet joy of my retirement was being systematically dismantled, one leopard print throw pillow at a time, and I was beginning to realize that if I didn't do something soon, I was going to lose my own home without ever having left it. The weeks following Brenda's arrival were a slow, methodical lesson in the art of invasion. It was a campaign of territorial expansion, waged not with armies and flags, but with lipstick tubes and leopard print throw pillows. My home, once a quiet sanctuary of memory and peace, had become a contested borderland, and I was losing. The first front in our quiet, domestic war was the garden. My garden was my pride and joy, a meticulously curated space of peace and beauty. It was where I felt closest to my late husband, Robert. We had designed it together, planted every rose bush, laid every stone in the path. Brenda, in what she called a fit of inspiration, decided it needed her help. I came out one morning to find she had uprooted a row of my prize-winning heirloom tomatoes, the ones I had been carefully nurturing from seeds Robert had saved, and had replaced them with a row of 6 bright pink plastic flamingos. Isn't it fun? She chirped when she saw the look of pure, unadulterated horror on my face. It just needed a little pop of color, a little bit of whimsy. You have to learn to loosen up. Helen, I had spent the rest of the day carefully replanting my tomatoes, my hands trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. I had removed the plastic flamingos and placed them, very deliberately, on the pile of things destined for the city dump. They were back in the garden the next morning. The second front was the mail. Her name began to appear on letters delivered to my address. First, it was catalogues for cheap, garish clothing, then magazines, then a credit card bill. Each envelope addressed to Brenda K. Marlowe at my address was a small, paper-based declaration of residency. It was a calculated move, a way of establishing a legal foothold in my home. She was not just a guest anymore, she was an occupant. The third, and most relentless, front was the living room. My living room, with its comfortable, well-worn armchairs and its shelves filled with Robert's history books, had always been the quiet heart of my home. It now became the social headquarters for Brenda's vast and surprisingly loud circle of friends. They would descend upon the house most afternoons for what she called her cocktail clatch, filling my quiet space with their loud, braying laughter, the cloying scent of their cheap perfume, and a thick, blue haze of cigarette smoke. Smoking, I should add, was a direct and explicit violation of Arthur's lease. I tried to establish boundaries. I tried to be the reasonable, polite landlady. Brenda, I'd say, my voice tight. Strained semblance of calm. I would appreciate it if you and your friends did not smoke in the house. Oh, Helen, don't be such a fuddy-duddy, she'd laugh, waving a dismissive, smoke-wreathed hand in my direction. It's just a little cigarette, live a little. Arthur. Tell your landlady to live a little. And Arthur, my friend, my quiet, gentle companion, would just give me a weak, apologetic shrug from the corner where he was being held captive by one of Brenda's boisterous friends. He was a man completely and utterly neutered, a willing prisoner of war in his own girlfriend's campaign of terror. I found myself retreating, spending more and more time in the quiet solitude of my own bedroom, a refugee in my own home. The sound of their laughter, of her loud, grating voice, became the soundtrack to my life. I was living in a state of constant, low-grade siege, and my own politeness, my own deeply ingrained need to be a good hostess, was my greatest enemy. I was losing the war, one plastic flamingo, one cigarette, but one stolen inch of territory at a time. The final, irrevocable, and soul-breaking straw was not a straw at all. It was a cashmere cardigan. It was a Friday night. I had been at my weekly volunteer shift at the Savannah Historical Society. A few blessed hours of quiet, orderly peace. I came home late, round 10 o'clock. My heart already sinking at the thought of the inevitable cocktail party I would have to navigate to get to my own bedroom. But the moment I opened the front door, I knew that tonight was different. The house was not just full, it was invaded. There were at least a dozen people I had never seen before crowded into my living room. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of spilled beer. A loud, terrible rock song was blasting from the stereo system, and in the center of it all, Brenda was holding court. She had organized a full-blown, no-holds-barred poker game right on my late husband's antique 18th century mahogany dining table. There were no coasters. Greasy pizza boxes were stacked on my sideboard. Someone had put out a cigarette. In one of my mother's potted ferns, I stood in the doorway, my coat still on, a silent, invisible ghost of fury in my own home. Arthur saw me and gave me a small, terrified, pleading look. I ignored him. My eyes were fixed on Brenda. She was laughing, a loud, braying sound, as she raked a pile of poker chips towards herself. She was the queen of this chaotic, ugly kingdom, and she was wearing my husband's sweater. It was his favorite, a beautiful, impossibly soft, dark, green cashmere cardigan he had owned for 30 years. It was the sweater he always wore on chilly autumn evenings. It was the sweater he was wearing in the last photograph I had ever taken of him. It still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco. It was a sacred object, a holy relic, a piece of him that I had kept, carefully folded in a cedar chest in my own bedroom closet. And this woman, this vulgar, invasive, and deeply disrespectful stranger, had gone into my private space, into my closet, into my memories, and she had taken it. She was wearing my husband's ghost as a party dress. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. A cold, quiet, and utterly profound calm settled over me. The kind of calm that comes after a bomb has gone off, the part of me that had been trying to be polite, to be accommodating, to be the good hostess, it died in that moment, and the woman who was left in its place was someone I had not met before. She was a woman who was done being reasonable. She was a woman who was ready to go to war. I turned, and without a word, I went up to my room and I locked the door. I waited, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the last of her loud, boorish friends finally left. I heard her and Arthur stumbling up the stairs, their drunken laughter echoing in the quiet house. I waited another hour, and then I went downstairs. The house was a disaster zone of empty bottles and dirty plates. And on the newel post of the main staircase, discarded like a dirty rag, was Robert's cardigan. I picked it up, held it to my face, and I wept. The confrontation happened the next morning. I was in the kitchen, a silent, avenging angel, when they came downstairs, looking hungover and unapologetic. I had the lease agreement, the one Arthur had signed a year ago, laid out on the kitchen table, and I had Robert's cardigan, now cleaned and folded, sitting next to it. "Good morning," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter sky. They both stopped, surprised by my tone. "We need to talk," I said. "Look, Helen, if this is about the party last night," Arthur began, his voice a weak, placating whine, "it is about much more than the party," I said, cutting him off. I looked at Brenda. "It is about this." I pointed to the cardigan. "This was my husband's, and you took it from my private closet." Brenda had the grace to look momentarily ashamed, but it passed quickly, replaced by a defensive sneer. "Oh, please, it's a sweater. I was cold." "No," I said, "it is not a sweater. It is a memory. It is a boundary, and you have crossed it for the last time." I tapped my finger on the lease agreement. "Arthur, I would like to direct your attention to section 4B, guests and occupancy. It states, and I quote, "No guest may reside in the property for more than 7 consecutive days in any given month wit, without the prior written consent of the "Oh no, Brenda," I said, turning my gaze to her. "You have been living in my home, a non-paying, unauthorized tenant, for 23 consecutive days. You are in material breach of this legally binding contract." Brenda let out a short, ugly laugh. "Oh, my God, are you serious? You're going to evict us over a sleepover party?" She looked at me, her eyes full of a pure, unadulterated contempt. "Don't be a jealous old crone, Helen. It's not like you're using the space. You're just a bitter, lonely old woman who can't stand to see someone else happy in your big, empty house." The cruelty of the words was breathtaking. But I did not flinch. I just looked at Arthur, at my friend, the man whose grief I had shared. "Arthur," I said, my voice quiet, a final appeal to the decent man I thought he was. "Please, this is my home. This is not our arrangement." He would not meet my eyes. He looked at Brenda, at her hard, defiant face, and he made his choice. "I think you're overreacting, Helen," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Brenda is my partner. You should be happy for me." And that was it, the final, absolute betrayal. He had not just chosen her over our friendship, he had chosen her over the law, over decency, over the simple, human respect that I was owed. He was a coward, a weak, spineless coward, and he was a willing accomplice to the invasion of my home. "I see," I said, my voice now completely devoid of all emotion. "You have made your position very clear." I stood up. The time for discussion, for appeals, for reason, was over. They had declared war. And they had no idea, not the slightest clue, of the formidable, meticulous, and deeply vengeful enemy they had just created. I was no longer their friend. I was no longer their hostess. I was their landlady, and they were, I decided in that moment, about to become very, very familiar with the specific and unforgiving language of landlord-tenant law. The quiet in my house after the confrontation was a new kind of silence. It was not the peaceful, comfortable silence of my life with Robert, nor was it the companionable, gentle silence I had shared with Arthur in the beginning. This was the cold, heavy, and deeply hostile silence of a cold war. Arthur and Brenda were now the enemy, an occupying force encamped on my second floor, and I, in my own home, became a resistance fighter. The gentle, polite, and slightly too trusting Helen. Gable was gone, a casualty of the recent battle. In her place was a woman I had not met before. She was cold, she was meticulous, and she was preparing to go to war. My first move was not one of aggression, but of reconnaissance. My late husband, Robert, had been an engineer, a man who believed in the power of data. "You cannot solve a problem," he used to say, "until you have accurately defined its parameters." My problem was Arthur and Brenda. I needed to define the full, legal parameters of their treachery. That afternoon, I retreated to my study, the one room in the house Brenda had not yet dared to colonize, and I transformed it into a command center. I went online and I began to study. I read the entirety of Georgia's landlord-tenant law. I read legal blogs. I watched tutorials on evidence gathering. I learned about the implied covenant of quiet enjoyment. about material breach of contract, about the precise legal definition of a tenant at sufferance. I was a 72-year-old widow, and I was giving myself a crash course in becoming a paralegal. Then I geared up. I ordered 3 small, discreet, and perfectly legal security cameras. The kind that look like USB chargers or smoke detectors. The law was clear. I could not record them in their private space, Arthur's bedroom and bathroom, but the common areas, my living room, my dining room, my kitchen, were a different story. They were my property, and I had a right to know what was happening within them. I also ordered a small, high-fidelity digital voice recorder, a device so small it could be hidden in the palm of my hand. My final purchase was a simple, beautiful, and very thick leather-bound daily planner. This would be my dossier, my war journal. On the first page, I wrote a simple title, The Gable House Evidence Log, and then I made my first entry. It was a detailed, 4-page, and utterly dispassionate account of the party, the cashmere cardigan, and the final, lease-breaking confrontation. Every insult, every threat, every word of disrespect was recorded in my neat, clear, and steady handwriting. The war had begun, and the first casualty, I decided, would be their plausible deniability. The month that followed was the longest and most strangely exhilarating of my life. I became a spy in my own home. I was a quiet, smiling, and deeply treacherous ghost, observing and documenting every single one of their transgressions with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist studying a particularly nasty strain of bacteria. Week 1. Establishing residency. My first objective was to prove, beyond any legal doubt, that Brenda was not a guest. She was an unauthorized tenant. This was the easiest part of my task. She made no effort to hide it. I began my log. Every morning, I would take a time-stamped photo of her car, still parked in my driveway from the night before. Monday, 7:15 a.m. Brenda Marlowe's vehicle present. Tuesday, 7:18 a.m. Vehicle present. Wednesday, 7:12 a.m. Vehicle present. I did this for 30 consecutive days. I photographed her mail, which began arriving with a new, alarming regularity. A bill from her credit card company, a catalogue from a cheap clothing store, a letter from her dentist, all addressed to her at my home. I documented each one. Date, Monday. Item, Visa bill for B. Marlowe. Status, photographed and logged. I documented her belongings. In the common areas, her presence was like a fungus, slowly spreading across my life. Her garish sequined jacket was a permanent fixture on my antique coat rack. Her collection of trashy romance novels began to colonize the bookshelf in the living room, displacing Robert's beloved history books. Her giant leopard print tote bag seemed to be surgically attached to my dining room table. I photographed it all, each new object a piece of evidence, a small, ugly brick in the wall of the legal case I was meticulously building against them. Week 2, the common areas. I installed the cameras. It was surprisingly easy. I placed one, disguised as a phone charger, in the living room outlet that had a perfect view of the sofa and the television, I placed another, a tiny, wide-angle lens hidden in a smoke detector. On the ceiling of the kitchen, they were my silent, unblinking witnesses. The footage they captured was a daily, soul-crushing portrait of their contempt for me. I would watch it at night, in the privacy of my study, a quiet, furious spy master reviewing the day's intelligence. I saw them treat my home like a cheap hotel. They would leave their dirty dishes in the sink for days. They would prop their feet up on my good furniture. They would rifle through my kitchen cabinets, eating my food, using my things without a single thought. But it was the audio that was the most damning. The cameras had microphones, and they, in their arrogant carelessness, spoke freely, assuming the old bat was out of earshot. Brenda, did you see the look on her face when she saw my flamingos in her garden? I thought she was going to have a stroke. It was hilarious, Arthur. You shouldn't provoke her, Brenda. Oh, relax. What's she going to do? Yell at us? She's a lonely old woman. She needs your rent money. She's not going to kick us out. We can do whatever we want. I transcribed every single word. Each conversation was another nail in their legal coffin. They were not just bad tenants, they were malicious ones. And they were admitting it on tape. Week 3, the parties and noise violations. Brenda, it turned out, was a social creature, a very, very loud social creature. She began to host her card game every Friday night, a rotating cast of her loud, boorish friends would descend upon my home, filling my quiet living room with cigar smoke and their raucous laughter until 2 a.m. I did not confront them. I documented. I used my phone to record the noise levels from my bedroom, the sound of their shouting, and the terrible country music they insisted on playing, all clearly audible. The lease agreement, I knew, had a quiet enjoyment clause, and every Friday night they violated it with a gleeful, unapologetic abandon. I now had hours of audio evidence of these violations, all neatly timed stamped. Week 4, the financial drain. The final piece of my dossier was the money. With 2 people now living in Arthur's room, taking long showers, running the air conditioning. Constantly, my utility bills skyrocketed. The water bill was up 30%, the electricity, nearly 40%. I chose my moment carefully. I waited until I knew one of the cameras was recording. And I approached them in the kitchen one evening, the utility bills in my hand. I was polite, I was reasonable. Arthur, Brenda, I began, my voice a perfect, calm monotone. The new utility bills have arrived, and as you can see, our usage has increased significantly since Brenda has been staying here. I showed them the comparison to the previous months. I think it's only fair that you contribute to the overage. Brenda looked at the bill, then at me, a look of pure, unadulterated disbelief on her face, as if I had just asked her to donate a kidney. You want me to pay for the water? She asked, her voice incredulous. Yes, I said, I think it's reasonable. Oh, for heaven's sake, Helen, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. That's part of your expenses as A landlord, it's the cost of doing business. You can't just nickel and dime your tenants. It's tacky. Arthur, as usual, just stood there, a silent, spineless jellyfish of a man. Very well, I said, and I walked away. I had my answer. And more importantly, I had the entire, beautiful, and legally damning conversation on video. After 30 days of this meticulous, soul-crushing, and deeply satisfying espionage, my work was done. I had my dossier. It was a thick, heavy binder, filled with a month's worth of daily logs. Time-stamped photographs, video transcripts, audio files, and financial statements. It was a perfect, ironclad, and utterly undeniable record of their campaign of disrespect and their flagrant violations of their legal contract. I made an appointment with a lawyer, a young, sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Albright. I walked into her sleek, modern office, a 72-year-old widow with a binder full of fury. She listened to my story at first with a look of polite, professional sympathy, the look of a lawyer who assumes she is dealing with a messy, emotional, she said roommate dispute, and then I opened the binder. I presented my case. I showed her the daily logs. I showed her the photographs of the mail, of the car, of the state of my living room after Brenda's parties. I played her the audio of the noise violations. I showed her the video clips from the security cameras, the clips of them eating my food, of them plotting against me, of them refusing to pay their share of the bills. I watched her face as she reviewed the evidence. The polite sympathy was replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, and that was replaced by the slow, predatory grin of a lawyer who has just been handed the easiest, most airtight case of her entire career. When I was done, she just looked at me and knew. Profound respect in her eyes. "Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice full of a quiet awe, "this is the most well-documented eviction case I have ever seen in my life. This isn't a case. This is a slam dunk." She explained the next step, a formal legal notice to cure or quit. It would give Arthur a non-negotiable, legally mandated 30 days. Either Brenda Marlowe, the unauthorized tenant, was permanently removed from the premises the cure, or he, the legal tenant, would be evicted the quit, and if they refused to leave, I asked. "Then we get a court order," she said with a grim smile, "and the sheriff will remove them for you. But it won't come to that. When they see this," she patted my beautiful, terrible binder, "they will know they have lost." She drafted the official notice that afternoon. It was a magnificent, terrifying legal document, citing every single one of my documented violations, from the unauthorized tenant to the unpaid utilities to the smoking in the house. It was a symphony of legal retribution. I walked out of her office, the official, notarized notice in my purse, the grief, the frustration, the feeling of being a helpless victim in my own home. It was all gone. All that was left was a cold, quiet, and profound sense of purpose. I was no longer a sad, lonely widow. I was a plaintiff. I was an intelligence agent, and I was about to become the most efficient, well-documented, and legally justified landlady in the entire state of Georgia. The time for observation was over. The time for action had finally arrived. I walked home from Miss Albright's law office with the eviction notice tucked safely in my purse. It was a formidable document, 3 pages of dense, single-spaced legal text, citing specific statutes and listing, in excruciating detail, every single one of Arthur's documented transgressions. It felt heavier than a simple stack of paper. It felt like a declaration of war. My hand, resting on my purse, was trembling slightly. Not with fear, but with a strange, cold, and deeply exhilarating sense of power. The time for being a victim was over. The time for being a plaintiff had begun. I waited for the perfect moment. I did not want to serve the notice to Arthur alone. I did not want to give Brenda the opportunity to claim she had been ambushed, or to twist the narrative to Arthur later, in private. No, this had to be a joint address. They had been a united front in their campaign of disrespect. They would be a united front in receiving their official rebuke. My moment came that evening. They were in the living room, my living room, sprawled on my sofa, watching some loud, obnoxious reality television show about house flippers in Las Vegas. The volume was, as usual, at a level that could shatter glass. They had a bag of greasy potato chips and a bottle of cheap wine on Robert's antique coffee table, and they were not using coasters. It was a perfect, compact diorama of their entire worldview. I walked in and stood in front of the television, blocking their view. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was clear and firm, and it cut through the noise of the television. Brenda looked up at me, a look of pure, unadulterated annoyance on her face. "Helen, you're in the way. They're about to reveal the kitchen renovation. I'm afraid I have something that requires your immediate attention," I said. I reached into my purse and pulled out 2 copies of the legal notice. I handed one to Arthur. I held the other one out to Brenda. "I'm not on the lease," she said with a smug, dismissive sneer. "You have no power over me. You are an unauthorized occupant residing in this property," I said, my voice as cold and flat as a coroner's report, "and as such, you are a central party to this notice. I suggest you read it." Arthur, his face a mask of confused apprehension, took the papers. Brenda, with a dramatic, put-upon sigh, snatched her copy from my hand. I watched them read. It was a magnificent thing to behold. I watched the color drain from Arthur's face. I saw his hand begin to tremble as he read the long, itemized list of his own failures, the unauthorized tenant, the noise violations, the unpaid utilities, the smoking, the unauthorized parties. He was seeing the last month of his life, not through the hazy glow of his infatuation with Brenda, but through the cold, hard, and unforgiving lens of the law. Brenda's reaction was different. Her face did not register shame or fear. It was a slow, beautiful, and deeply satisfying blossoming of pure, apoplectic rage. Her eyes, scanning the pages, narrowed into slits of venomous fury. "What is this?" she finally hissed. "The papers." Shaking in her hand, notice to cure or quit. "What the hell is this, Helen? It is, I believe, quite self-explanatory. I said calmly. You have two options. Option A, the cure. Is that you? Brenda, permanently vacate my home within 24 hours with all of your belongings and never reside here again. Option B, the quit, is that you both vacate the premises within 30 days. If neither of these conditions is met, the sheriff's department will be here on the 31st day to remove you and your belongings from my property. It is your choice. For a moment, they were both stunned into a beautiful, blessed silence. They just stared at the papers, then at me, as if I had suddenly transformed into a creature from another planet. And then the explosion. You crazy old bitch, Brenda shrieked, leaping up from the sofa, the legal papers crushed in her fist. You can't do this. We haven't done anything wrong. We'll sue you. We'll sue you for harassment, will you? I asked, my voice still perfectly, maddeningly calm. I reached down and picked up the thick, black binder I had placed on the floor beside me, my dossier, because in order to sue me for harassment, you would have to refute the evidence that I have painstakingly gathered over the past 31 days. I opened the binder. You claim you haven't done anything wrong, I said, my voice the cool, detached tone of a prosecutor presenting her case. Let's review. You claim, Brenda, that you are not residing here. I present to you Exhibit A, I said, flipping to the first section. 31 dated and time-stamped photographs of your vehicle parked in my driveway every single morning. And Exhibit B, copies of your own personal mail credit card bills, bank statements delivered to this address, an address where you are not a legal tenant. Brenda's face was a beautiful picture of sputtering, speechless rage. You claim you are not a nuisance, I continued, my voice a relentless, logical steamroller. I present to you Exhibit C, 12 hours of audio recordings from my private bedroom, in which the noise levels from your late-night parties are clearly in violation of the City of Savannah's noise ordinance. And Exhibit D, a signed and notarized statement from my next-door neighbor, a man who has been forced to listen to your terrible country music at 2 o'clock in the morning every Friday for the past Nth. I turned a page, and then there is the matter of your own words. I looked at Arthur, at my sad, pathetic, and traitorous friend. I present to you Exhibit E, a full, unedited transcript of a video-recorded conversation that took place in this very kitchen 2 weeks ago. In it, Brenda, you refer to me as a lonely old bat. And you, Arthur, agree with her. I looked at Brenda again, and in that same conversation, Brenda, you state, and I quote, she needs your rent money. She's not going to kick us out. We can do whatever we want. It seems you made a slight miscalculation. They were silent. The sheer, overwhelming, and meticulously documented weight of their own transgressions had finally crushed them, their blustering, their threats, their righteous indignation. It had all evaporated, leaving only the ugly, pathetic truth of their own bad behavior. Arthur had slumped back onto the sofa, his face buried in his hands. Brenda was just staring at me, her mouth hanging open, her eyes full of a new and deeply satisfying emotion. Fear. You have 30 days. "Arthur," I said, my voice now soft, but with the finality of a judge's gavel, "I suggest you start packing." I turned, my back straight, my heart a calm, steady beat, and I walked out of the living room, leaving them to drown in the beautiful, terrible, and utterly inescapable silence of their own defeat. The 30 days that followed were a cold war, a miserable, tense, and deeply unpleasant war of attrition, fought in the hallways and the kitchen of my own home. They did not speak to me. They communicated only through slammed doors and the aggressive, passive-aggressive placement of their dirty dishes in the sink. They were ghosts of resentment, haunting my every move. They tried their best to make my life a living hell. Brenda would accidentally leave the freezer door ajar, spoiling my food. Arthur would accidentally trample my prize-winning petunias while taking out the trash. They were small, petty acts of childish vengeance, and I ignored them all. I was a mountain of calm, serene indifference. I had already won the war. This was just the sad, pathetic mopping-up operation. Their other front in this war was social. They began a smear campaign. I started getting phone calls from our mutual friends, from members of my book club, my gardening society. "Helen, dear, is it true?" one of them asked, her voice full of a gossipy concern. "Brenda told me you're kicking poor Arthur out onto the street. She said you were jealous of their happiness, to each of them." I was calm and direct. There are two sides to every story, Martha, I'd say, and I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss the legal details. But I can assure you, I have very good reasons for my actions. I was a rock, and their waves of second-hand gossip broke against me. During this time, my only real solace was in the memory of my husband, one particularly tense evening. After Brenda had accidentally spilled red wine on my favorite white armchair, I retreated to my study. I took out an old photo album, one from our trip to the Philippines 20 years ago. Robert had been stationed at the U.S. Naval Base at Subic Bay when he was a young engineer. Long before I met him, he had fallen in love with the country, with its chaos and its beauty and its warmth. The trip had been his anniversary gift to me. I flipped through the photos, us, looking young and happy. On a beach with sand as white as sugar, us, eating a feast of grilled fish from a banana leaf. And then a photo of us in a small, beautiful town he had insisted we visit, a place that had, for some reason, captured his heart. Cybolum, I remembered the people, their incredible, resilient warmth in the face of a life that was not always easy. I remembered Robert, standing on a dusty road, looking out at the green mountains, a look of profound peace on his face. "These people," he had said to me, his voice full of a quiet awe, "they know how to endure. They know how to bend in the storm, and how to stand up straight again when it has passed." I closed the album, a new sense of peace and resolve settling over me. I was not just a lonely widow in Savannah. I was the wife of a man who had understood the world, and I was, in my own way, a woman who knew how to endure. This storm in my house would pass, and I would still be standing. On the 30th and final day of the notice, a large, yellow-moving truck pulled up to the front of my house. I sat on my front porch, a cup of tea in my hand, and I watched. I watched as the burly movers carried out Arthur's sensible, boring furniture. I watched as they carried out Brenda's collection of tacky, leopard print lamps and garish, oversized art. Arthur did not look at me. He just scurried back and forth, his face a mask of grey. Defeated shame, but Brenda, as she carried the last box to the truck, stopped at the end of my walkway. She looked at me, at my calm, serene face, and she gave me a look of such pure, unadulterated, and eternal hatred that it was almost a thing of beauty. It was the look of a parasite that has just been forcibly removed from its host. I just smiled back at her, a small, polite, and completely victorious smile. I gave her a little wave. She got into the passenger seat of Arthur's car. He got in behind the wheel, and they drove away, out of my life, out of my home, forever. The silence they left behind was the most beautiful sound in the world. The war was over, I had won, and my house, my beautiful, crooked, and now peaceful house, was finally, blessedly, my own again. The silence in my house after they left was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. For the first time in months, the air was still. It did not carry the scent of Brenda's cheap perfume or the stale ghost of her cigarettes. It did not echo with the sound of her loud, grating laughter or the brain-dead chatter of her reality television shows. It was just quiet, my quiet, Robert's quiet. The house took a deep, contented breath, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I could breathe, too. I spent the next 2 days performing a ritual of reconquest, a gentle domestic exorcism. I opened every single window, letting the warm, jasmine-scented Savannah air chase the last of their presence out of the rooms. I stripped the beds in the guest suite, washing the sheets twice on the hottest setting. I gathered every last trace of Brenda the tacky romance novels. The half-empty bottle of saccharine pink wine, the single, sad, leopard print sock I found under the sofa cushion, and I placed it all in a large, black trash bag. I then performed a deeply satisfying, almost ceremonial march to the curb and deposited the bag into the city's garbage bin. It was a burial. The ghost of Brenda was exorcised. My home was mine again, but the world outside it was still a hostile territory. The social fallout from my righteous eviction had been swift and predictable. Arthur and Brenda had done a masterful job of painting me as the villain of their story. I received a series of cold, disappointed phone calls from friends in my book club and my gardening society. Helen, I was so shocked to hear what you did to poor Arthur, one of them said, her voice dripping with a cloying, false sympathy. Brenda told me you just threw them out onto the street. After all they've been through, it just seems so cruel. I tried to defend myself, to explain the lease violations, the disrespect, the final unforgivable insult of the cashmere cardigan, but their minds were already made up. I was the lonely, jealous, bitter old widow who couldn't stand to see her friend find new happiness. I had become the crazy old crone Brenda had accused me of being, in the small, gossipy world of our retirement community, my reputation was in tatters. I had won the battle for my house, but I had lost the war for my good name, and the injustice of it, the quiet, corrosive loneliness of being so profoundly misunderstood, was anew. And in many ways more painful, kind of siege, it was my granddaughter, a sharp, funny, and terminally online law student, who gave me my new weapon. I was on a video call with her, explaining the miserable social aftermath of my victory. So they're all shunning you because you enforced a legal contract? She asked, a look of millennial disbelief on her face. Grandma, this is a classic case for the court of public opinion. What are you talking about, dear? I asked. Reddit, Grandma, she said. As if it were the most obvious thing in the world. There's a community for exactly this. It's called Am I the Asshole? You just tell your story, and the internet will be your jury. It was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard. The internet, to me, was a place for checking my email and looking up recipes for lemon meringue pie. But the idea, as strange as it was, took root. I had been judged and convicted by the small, closed court of my own social circle. Perhaps it was time for an appeal to a higher court, a court of millions of anonymous strangers. That evening, Sunday, August 10th, I sat down at my late husband's large oak desk. I poured myself a small glass of sherry, and for the first time in my life, I navigated to a website called Reddit. I found the community, and I began to write. I wrote for 3 hours. I was no longer a lonely widow. I was a historian, a witness, a plaintiff, and this was my final, definitive testimony. Asterisk title. 8 for evicting my 74-year-old roommate after his new girlfriend 6/8 of 3 months tried to take over my house. Asterisk hello. Reddit, I am a 72-year-old widow. Please excuse any formatting errors. As this is my first time using this platform, my granddaughter is helping me. I find myself in a situation that has cost me several friendships, and I am genuinely beginning to question my own judgment. 2 years ago, my husband of 50 years passed away. Our home, a large, historic house in Savannah, Georgia, felt incredibly empty. To help with the expenses and for companionship, I decided to rent out our upstairs guest suite. I found a wonderful tenant, a 74-year-old retired professor named Arthur, a widower himself. For a year, our arrangement was a quiet, respectful, and pleasant companionship. He was a friend. For months ago, Arthur began dating a woman named Brenda 6/8F. At first, I was happy for him. Brenda was charming and full of life. But then she started moving in, not officially. It was a slow, insidious process. First, it was her toothbrush, then her clothes in Arthur's closet, then her mail started arriving. Soon, she was staying over every single night. The lease Arthur signed is very clear. No guest may reside in the property for more than 7 consecutive days. Brenda had been living in my home, a non-paying, unauthorized tenant, for weeks. She also began to treat my home as her own in other ways. She would eat my food, use my things without asking, and reorganize my kitchen to her liking. She began hosting loud, late-night parties with her friends, smoking in my non-smoking house, and leaving terrible messes for me to clean up. I tried to be polite. I am, by nature, a non-confrontational person. I would leave gentle notes, which were ignored. I would make gentle requests, which were dismissed with a laugh. The situation came to a head last month. I came home from a volunteer shift to find a full-blown poker game happening on my late husband's antique dining table. The house was a wreck, and Brenda was wearing my late husband's favorite cashmere cardigan, which she had taken from my private bedroom closet. This was, for me, the final straw. The next morning, I confronted them both. I calmly and politely pointed out the numerous, flagrant violations of the lease agreement. Brenda's response was to laugh in my face. She called me a jealous old crone and a bitter, lonely old woman. My friend, Arthur, the man whose companionship I had cherished, said nothing. He sided with her. He told me I was overreacting. So I did what I had to do. I hired a lawyer. I had spent the previous month meticulously documenting every single violation, with dates, times, and photographs. My lawyer served Arthur with a formal, legal notice to cure or quit. It gave him 30 days. Either Brenda moved out, or they both did. The 30 days were a nightmare of cold silences and petty hostility. In the end, they both moved out. Now I have my beautiful, quiet house back. But the story they have told our mutual friends is that I, the lonely, jealous landlady, kicked a poor, old man out onto the street simply because he had found love. I have lost friends over this. I am being treated like a villain. I believe I was a property owner, enforcing a legally binding contract that was being flagrantly and disrespectfully violated. They believe I was an asshole. So, Reddit, I ask you, Eta, I finished writing. My heart was pounding. I had just laid the most painful, humiliating chapter of my recent life bare for the entire world to see. With a trembling finger, I clicked the post button. The response was not a trickle, it was a tidal wave. NTA, NTA, NTA. 1,000 times NTA. Your roommate wasn't a tenant, he was a friend. And he betrayed that friendship. Brenda wasn't a girlfriend, she was a parasite. You are not a villain. You are a legend. NTA. The moment she put on your dead husband's sweater, all bets were off. That wasn't a boundary cross. That was a declaration of war. I would have thrown her and all her poker buddies out onto the street that very night. And as a lawyer, let me just say, your meticulous documentation is a work of art. You are the patron saint of landladies everywhere. I wish all my clients were as thorough as you. NTA. They called you a lonely old crone. No, honey. You're a queen. You protected your home, your peace, and your late husband's memory. You did the right thing. The post went viral. My granddaughter called me, screaming with a joy that was so loud it made my old ears ring. Grandma, you're on the front page of Reddit. You're trending on Twitter. You're a star. The comments were a flood of warmth, of humor, of righteous indignation on my behalf. They came from all over the world, from young people in college, from other widows, from landlords, from tenants. They were a vast, anonymous, and wonderful jury, and their verdict was unanimous. I was not the asshole. I sat there in the quiet of my study, the glow of the screen illuminating my face, and I cried, tears of relief, tears of vindication. I had lost the small, petty court of my local social circle, but I had won in the great, chaotic, and surprisingly wise court of the entire world. I thought of Robert, my engineer, and his love for the beautiful, resilient people of the Philippines. I thought of the stories he told of Cybolum, of the spirit of Bayanahan, of a community coming together to lift each other up in a strange, modern, and deeply unexpected way. I had found my own village, a global village of strangers who had seen my story and who had, for a brief, beautiful moment, come together to lift me up. A few weeks later, the noise had died down. I was a fleeting, minor internet celebrity. But the feeling of peace, of vindication, it remained my old life, had returned, but it was different now. I was different. I was no longer the sad, lonely widow. I was the woman who had fought a quiet war, and won. I was at my local community garden, a place Robert and I had loved, tending to my roses. "Excuse me," a man's voice said, a gentle, rumbling baritone. I looked up. He was an older gentleman, with kind eyes and a warm smile, holding a trowel. "I know this is a strange question, but are you the famous landlady from the internet?" I looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, I laughed, a real, genuine, and truly happy laugh. "Yes," I said, "I suppose I am. I'm George," he said, his smile widening, "and I just wanted to say, I read your story, and I was rooting for you. We talked for an hour about roses, and about roommates, and about the strange, unexpected battles of a life in retirement. And as I walked home that afternoon, my heart felt light. The house was no longer empty. It was full of the quiet, contented presence of just one person, me, and my new friend, George had promised to come over for a game of Scrabble next week. The war was over, the ghosts were gone, and a new, quiet, and deeply hopeful chapter of my own story was just beginning. The day after Arthur and Brenda moved out, I expected to feel a profound sense of relief, and I did for a time. The quiet in my house was a beautiful, healing balm. But as the days turned into a week, a new, unwelcome feeling began to creep in. The silence began to feel less like peace and more like emptiness. The war was over, but my house now felt like a pristine, silent, and lonely battlefield. I had won back my territory, but I was the sole occupant of a fortress that no longer had any enemies. My life, which had been so consumed with my secret mission, now felt purposeless. I would wake up in the morning with nothing to document, no new transgressions to log. The adrenaline was gone, the righteous anger was gone. All that was left was me, a 72-year-old woman in a very large, very quiet house. The victory, it turned out, was a lonely prize, The viral fame from my Reddit post was a strange and fleeting distraction. I received dozens of emails from strangers, all praising my courage. My meticulous planning. A television producer from a daytime talk show even called, asking if I would be willing to share my story on a segment about nightmare roommates. I politely declined. My revenge on Arthur and Brenda had been a private war that I was forced to make public for my own vindication, but I had no desire to become a professional victim, a traveling sideshow in the circus of daytime television. I found myself spending most of my time in the one place that still felt honest and real, my garden. I would spend hours on my knees in the rich, dark soil, my hands covered in dirt, tending to my roses, the world of lawyers and leases, of petty cruelties and viral vindication. All of it seemed to fade away when I was with my plants. They did not lie, they did not scheme, they simply grew. They asked only for sun and water, and a patient hand. It was there, in the quiet, fragrant world of my garden, that I met George again. I had seen him at the community garden plot a few times since our first brief conversation. He was a widower, like me, a retired professor of botany with hands as gentle and knowing as my own. We would talk, at first, about aphids and soil acidity and the best time to prune roses. Then we began to talk about other things, about our late spouses, about the strange, untethered feeling of being old in a world that is obsessed with being new, about the quiet, profound, and often lonely work of tending to the memories of a life already lived. He did not see me as the famous landlady from the internet. He saw me as Helen, a woman who knew the difference between a grandiflora and a floribunda. He was the first person I had met in a very long time who was not a part of the war. He was a symbol of the peace that might come after. One afternoon, as we were working in our respective garden plots, he told me a story. My wife, she was an artist, he said, his voice a soft, nostalgic murmur, and she used to say that every garden was a story. This part here, he gestured to a chaotic, beautiful patch of wild flowers. This is the wild, passionate beginning. And this part here, he pointed to a neat, orderly row of vegetables. This is the boring, practical middle part, where all the real work gets done. He smiled a sad, gentle smile. She always said she was still working on the ending. I looked at my own life. I had the passionate beginning with Robert. I had the long, practical, and beautiful middle part. And then I had the ugly, chaotic, and deeply unexpected climax of my war with Arthur and Brenda. But what now? What was my ending? Was it to be this, a quiet, lonely, and victorious peace? That evening, George invited me over to his small, neat house for dinner. At the end of the meal, he brought out a box of old photographs, and he showed me a picture of his wife. She was beautiful, and in her eyes I saw the same mischievous, rebellious spark I had seen in my own reflection during the Great Fence War. And then he showed me a picture of the two of them, taken 20 years ago on a trip. They were standing on a beach, the sand a brilliant white, the water a perfect turquoise blue, a small, beautiful mountain rising in the distance, the Philippines. He said, his voice full of a deep, abiding love. She was a nurse there in the Peace Corps before I met her, in a small town called. He paused, trying to remember the name. Cybolum. She always said it was the most beautiful place on earth. She said the people there, they understood how to build things that last. I stared at the photograph, at the image of this beautiful, distant, and deeply peaceful place, and a new, quiet, and utterly unexpected idea began to form in my mind. An idea not of revenge, not of war, but of a new and better kind of story. The final scene of my story does not take place in a courtroom. It does not take place in a quiet, lonely house. It takes place 6 months later. I am not in Savannah. I am in Cybolum. George is with me. We are not tourists. We are volunteers. The story my viral post had generated had come with an unexpected side effect. A book deal, a small, independent publisher had offered me a modest advance to write a humorous memoir about my experience. I had accepted, and the money from that advance, every single penny of it, was being used to fund our new project. We are working with a small, local non-profit, the same one my friend's wife had worked with, to build a new community garden for the town, a place where the old can teach the young how to grow their own food, how to be self-sufficient, how to build something that lasts. I am on my knees in the rich, warm Philippine soil. A trowel in my hand, the sun on my back, my hands are covered in dirt. George is beside me, teaching a group of laughing children the difference between a weed and a seedling. The house in Savannah, the petty tyrant Harrington. The war of the musical fence, it all feels like a story from another lifetime, from another world. My revenge was a beautiful, pointless, and deeply satisfying joke. But the encore, the quiet, final act of my story was this. Taking the small, strange fame my anger had brought me and turning it into something useful, something good, something that I hoped my dear friend Maria would have been proud of. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am a 73-year-old widow, a retired music teacher, a gardener, and my story was not about an ending. It was about learning, in the late, quiet autumn of my life, how to plant a new and better and far more beautiful beginning.